Yeah. Yeah. Hello, and welcome to my presentation on strategies to best support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students in the secondary English classroom. Okay. As a pre-service teacher, I have a professional responsibility to ensure that I am constantly taking opportunities to reflect on how I can develop as an educator to best support the needs of a diverse range of students. By reflecting and reviewing my current competencies about the Australian professional standards for teachers at the graduate level, I have identified APST 1.4 strategies for teaching Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students as the area in which I have the biggest gap in my understanding and practical application. In 2008, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd read in Parliament a formal apology to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians for the stolen generation and the discriminatory policies of past governments. In this landmark speech, he emphasised education as the primary vehicle for promoting reconciliation and closing the gap that exists between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians due to historical oppression. Focus Area 1.4 is an example of a move made by the education system to close the gap in educational achievement between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians by making it a standard for teachers to have knowledge of strategies to best support Indigenous students. This focus is echoed within the Australian curriculum itself by providing for multiple means of representation, action, expression, and engagement to support the diverse needs of learners, especially the needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. The purpose of this presentation today is to conduct an academic review on the relevant academic literature for this topic, and taking the findings from this review, create a plan to broaden knowledge of how to implement strategies to best support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students in the classroom, while simultaneously bringing myself in line with the competencies of the Australian Professional Standards for Teachers at the proficient level, which state that for Focus Level 1.4, teachers must not only have a knowledge of these strategies, but also design and implement these strategies in their own classroom. A comprehensive review of the literature revealed three primary areas of focus in relation to this topic. These areas include practical strategies for working with students, collaboration as a strategy to support Indigenous learners, and finally, the importance of professional development opportunities to help teachers know how to best support their Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. There were two primary practical strategies that had overwhelming support in the literature: 8 Ways pedagogy and direct instruction. Multiple sources point to, and this is from Hayward and Perso and Yunka Porter and McGinty, 8 Ways pedagogy is one of the best ways of supporting student learning in the classroom, especially Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. Younger Porty and McGinty 2009 stresses the importance of creating a classroom environment that is culturally responsive to the needs of Indigenous students. 8 Ways is a pedagogical framework that combines narrative-driven learning, community engagement, place-based learning, and visual representations, ensuring that teaching methods resonate with the cultural backgrounds of Indigenous students. Research has shown that reinforcing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students' cultural identities through frameworks like 8 Ways does improve their performance in the classroom overall. Younger Porter and McGinty contend that Aboriginal perspectives do not come necessarily from content about Indigenous peoples, but from Indigenous processes about knowledge transmission. Kanu 2005 reinforces this idea, arguing that teachers' lack of familiarity and awareness of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander approaches to teaching was a major impediment to making the curriculum comprehensible to Indigenous students. Without this knowledge, teachers could not act as a bridge between cultures and different ways of knowing, and could not support students in any cultural conflicts that might arise. 8 Ways, although I had read about it before, was not a pedagogy that I had thought I would ever really implement in my own classroom. But after conducting this first part of the literature review, I know now that I need a pedagogical framework tailored to support my Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students specifically, that makes learning relevant to them by harnessing traditional ways of knowing. Direct instruction is another research-supported strategy that supports Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. Direct instruction involves the explicit teaching of a task or skill using face-to-face lectures or demonstrations, as opposed to a student-led constructivist approach to learning like 8 Ways. A recent study that compared data from rural Indigenous schools that actively used direct instruction in their literacy program to schools that didn't found that schools that did scored overwhelmingly better in almost every literacy area. Schools involved in the program saw a 124% increase in reading and a 180% increase in spelling and punctuation. There is little to no established literature comparing the effectiveness of a constructivist approach like 8 Ways to a teacher-led approach like direct instruction, but both methods have been shown in the literature to be effective. Current research supports the implementation of a relational, connected approach to teaching and learning, which emphasizes collaboration and relationships between teachers, students, parents, and community elders as one of the most effective ways of teaching and supporting Indigenous students in the classroom. Connectedness is a primary organising principle for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, with community forming a major part of their identity. Indigenous students exist as part of a strong social network which educators must be aware of to effectively support them in their learning. McCluskey and Dole 2015 argue that the best outcomes and support for Indigenous students occur when schools adopt a partnership focused approach to education of their Indigenous students. This means that members of the community, especially relevant elders, have a direct influence on the curriculum and teaching practice. Studies have shown that pedagogies and learning activities that include Aboriginal voices and perspectives, whether that be from Aboriginal students, teachers, community elders, or colleagues, are the cornerstone of effective strategies for engaging Indigenous students. A practical case exemplifying this finding occurred between 2012 and 2017, when Bessarab, Bitink, Papertalk, Thakra, and Thompson implemented the More Than Talk program, a school-wide program in Western Australia, which involved bringing members of the community into all facets of school life and emphasised forging strong collaborative relationships between school and the Indigenous community. Findings from this study found that schools that created a collaborative educational environment allowed Indigenous students to flourish, which was reflected in their academic results and general well-being. This study also found, however, that parental engagement was often very limited when it came to Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander students. Aboriginal parental engagement is affected by many factors, including the impact of past policies and practices where schools were not very welcoming and expectations for achievement among Aboriginal children were low. The research does indicate that engaging parents in their children's education does lead to a higher academic outcome and attendance, even more so for Indigenous students. There are a number of programs highlighted by the literature that are successful in bringing in the contribution of Indigenous parents into the classroom. Yep, that's fine. With none of them found to be ineffective, the most prominent example being the Aboriginal Parental Engagement Program. A prime example exemplifying a gap in my knowledge that I found in undertaking this literature review was my lack of understanding of the role that my fellow Indigenous staff members could play in supporting my classroom. McCluskey and Dole 2015 emphasized this fact, highlighting how pre-service and graduate teachers need to recognize the unique knowledge these staff members have and utilize the connections they have with the local community, parents, and the students themselves. Indigenous teachers are able to provide pre-service teachers with strategies to make the curriculum more relevant, as well as keeping Indigenous learners engaged. It is important to note that all these research strategies to foster collaboration amongst constituents are directly in line with 8 Ways pedagogy, which prioritizes community links as one of its primary pedagogical strategies. There was overwhelming consensus in the literature that educators must collaborate with the community, parents, and fellow staff to best support the learning of Indigenous students. In general, the one thing that most of the literature agreed on was a lack of planning for teaching professional development to pre-service and graduate level teachers on the topic of Indigenous teaching. This includes deficiencies in professional development and preparing teachers, especially pre-service teachers, to work collaboratively with Aboriginal students and their families. By not placing emphasis on professional development to support Indigenous students, pre-service teachers and graduate teachers lack the appropriate understanding of Indigenous cultures, perspectives, and languages, as well as the strategies to best support them learning in the classroom. This leads to a lack of integration and Indigenous students struggling to engage with curriculum materials, ultimately leading to poor academic performance. A study conducted by Craven, Hahn, and Young in 2014 found that professional development in Indigenous teaching and learning was successful in broadening their understanding of Indigenous teaching strategies, as well as increasing their likelihood to adopt specific Aboriginal teaching strategies like Eight Ways. Based on these findings, Craven, Hahn, and Young contended that pre-service and graduate teachers must continually develop their Indigenous teaching via professional development throughout their careers. By undergoing a systematic review of the literature, there are 3 areas of professional practice that I will be updating in order to better support Indigenous students in my secondary English classroom. The 3 main areas include adopting 8 Ways as a pedagogical framework, placing significant emphasis on collaboration, and looking for opportunities for professional development on Indigenous teaching. In my current practice, I've definitely prioritized direct instruction as my primary pedagogy to support the diverse needs of learners in the classroom, including Indigenous students. In light of the findings of the literature review, I will now be prioritizing 8 Ways pedagogy as a strategy to support all learners in my secondary English classroom. As previously mentioned, multiple sources point to 8 Ways pedagogy as one of the best ways of supporting student learning in the classroom, especially Indigenous students. An example of 8 Ways pedagogy being used to teach the English curriculum would be to start a lesson off with a yarning circle, whereby each student is called to recall and share a perspective with the group, activating prior learning whilst also giving time for Indigenous students to feel heard and provide their own perspectives. This is in line with the story sharing component of 8 Ways. Another example of using 8 Ways would be if I was breaking down how to write an effective Peel paragraph. I would deconstruct the process into each of its 4 steps before reconstructing it and presenting it all together. This would be an example of using the deconstruct reconstruct component in 8 Ways. These are but 2 examples of how I would use 8 Ways pedagogy to support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students in my English classroom. In my current teaching practice, I have not placed nearly enough emphasis on the contribution that the community, parents, and other staff could have on learning and teaching in my English classroom. In completing the literature review, I am now cognizant that to effectively support my Indigenous students, I need to be aware of the role community plays in their identity and that they exist as part of a strong social network, which educators must be aware of to effectively support them in their learning. In a secondary English context, this means that parents, community elders, and Indigenous staff must be consulted at all stages of the learning and teaching process in teaching the English syllabus. That this means, as an educator, I have the responsibility to establish contact with parents and elders of Indigenous students, gain their insight and collaboration, and keep them updated throughout the term on how they are doing in their English studies. This includes gaining invaluable insight into the choice of text used in the classroom, as well as learning activities. Following the literary review, I now realize that all three of these constituents can offer me valuable knowledge on how I can integrate into curriculum materials and learning activities Indigenous perspectives. As previously mentioned, studies have shown that pedagogies and learning activities that include Aboriginal voices and perspectives, whether that be from Aboriginal students, teachers, or community elders, are the cornerstone of effective strategies for engaging Indigenous students. This is a change that I will be implementing in the future. The third and final area of professional practice that I will be changing is prioritising professional development opportunities on Indigenous teaching. As of right now, I have attended no professional development opportunities on this topic, and this needs to change, as studies have shown that professional development in Indigenous teaching and learning was successful in broadening understanding of Indigenous teaching strategies, which is the focus area 1.4, and also the area that I have the biggest gap in my knowledge, understanding, and practical application. In line with these findings, I have identified an online professional development opportunity conducted by the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, which is aimed at fostering a greater understanding of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's histories and issues for educators that undergo the course. I understand from the literature review that professional development in Indigenous teaching is a career long process, and I look forward to finding opportunities in the future that equip me with the knowledge to best support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students in my classroom. By adopting 8 Ways as a pedagogical framework, placing significant emphasis on collaboration, and looking for opportunities for professional development on Indigenous teaching in response to this literature review, I believe that I will be moving in the direction with the competencies expected by the Australian Professional Standards for Teachers at the proficient level, which state that for Focus Level 1.4, teachers must not only have a knowledge of these strategies, but also design and implement these strategies in their own classroom, which was ultimately what the purpose of my future plan was for. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Those are my references. Thank you.